Rivers rarely appear urgent at first glance. They move with quiet consistency, following paths carved over thousands of years. From the shoreline, the motion often looks simple. Water passing stones, current sliding along bends, a surface that reflects sky and trees. Yet the same water can change character within hours. Across many regions of North America, long river systems gather water from vast watersheds. Rain that falls hundreds of miles away eventually moves toward the same channels. Small tributaries feed larger rivers, and those rivers continue downstream through farmland, forest, and small towns. During normal conditions, kayakers travel these waters regularly. The current offers steady movement without overwhelming force. Gravel bars provide places to rest. Tree-lined banks create natural corridors that guide the route forward. But rivers do not operate on human schedules. When heavy rainfall spreads across a watershed, the change does not always appear immediately. Upstream tributaries begin to swell. Smaller streams rise first, feeding larger channels further downstream. Gradually, the system gathers momentum. Water that once moved at a measured pace begins accelerating. To someone on the river, the transition can be subtle at first. The surface grows slightly faster. Eddies tighten along the banks. Debris appears more frequently in the flow. Most of the time, paddlers recognize these signs and adjust. They move toward shore. They shorten their trips. They leave the water before the current grows difficult. But on one stretch of river, during a period of rapidly rising water, a single kayaker remained in the channel longer than planned. Over the hours that followed, the river would carry him far beyond his intended route. And by the time the distance became clear, turning back was no longer possible. Long before the floodwaters gathered speed, the river was already familiar to many paddlers who lived nearby. It was not considered extreme water during most of the year. In ordinary conditions, the current moved steadily but predictably. Kayakers used the route for day trips, training runs, and quiet travel through long stretches of undeveloped land. Among those who spent time on the water was an experienced recreational kayaker named Scott Bales. Bales lived in the state of Ohio, where rivers like the Great Miami River form long corridors through farmland and small cities. For paddlers in the region, these waterways offered accessible wilderness. A person could launch a small boat in one town and drift through miles of quiet shoreline before reaching the next bridge or landing. Bales had spent years kayaking local rivers. He was not part of a competitive expedition and had no intention of testing extreme conditions. His trips were typically routine: a kayak, basic safety gear, and a planned route that could be completed within a day. Like many recreational paddlers, he relied on a simple rhythm: launch the kayak, follow the current, and exit at a predetermined access point further downstream. The Great Miami River normally allowed that kind of planning. Under stable weather, the current moved at a pace that gave paddlers control. A person could steer across the channel, rest near the banks, or stop along gravel bars that appeared during lower water levels. But rivers in the American Midwest respond quickly to rainfall. In the days before Bales launched his kayak, storms had passed through parts of the watershed. Rainfall upstream had begun feeding the river system. Tributaries carried additional water toward the main channel. These changes were not always obvious from a single location along the riverbank. Conditions might appear manageable at one access point, while water further upstream was already rising. On April 2001, Bales entered the river, expecting a normal outing. He launched his kayak from a point along the Great Miami River near Dayton, Ohio, an area where paddlers often begin downstream trips. From there, the river winds south through a long corridor that passes farmland, wooded banks, and several towns before continuing toward the Ohio River. A typical recreational trip might cover a modest distance. Paddlers choose an entry point and arrange transportation at a downstream exit. The current helps move the kayak forward, but the paddler remains in control of direction and speed. On that day, Bales carried the equipment typical for a short paddle: his kayak, paddle, and personal safety gear. Nothing suggested that the trip would become unusual. The river itself did not yet appear dangerous. Water levels were higher than average, but rivers frequently rise and fall during seasonal weather. Many paddlers continue to travel during these periods, especially when conditions remain within familiar limits. At the start of the journey, the current simply moved faster than usual. For an experienced kayaker, a stronger current can feel efficient. The boat travels further with less effort. Long sections of river pass quickly beneath the hull. Landmarks appear sooner than expected. At first, the change might even seem helpful. But the increased speed of a river brings another consequence. As water accelerates, control decreases. Small steering adjustments have less effect. Crossing the channel becomes more difficult. Approaching the shoreline requires careful timing. Meanwhile, upstream rainfall continued feeding the river. Water that had fallen miles away was already moving toward the same channel. Bales was traveling. Tributaries were delivering new volume into the river system hour by hour. Downstream, the river corridor stretched through more than 100 miles of connected waterway. At the beginning of the trip, that distance meant very little. By the end, it would define the scale of the journey. During the early part of the trip, the river moved quickly but remained manageable. The kayak traveled with less paddling than usual. The current carried the boat forward through long bends in the channel, past wooded banks and stretches of open farmland. For a time, the conditions resembled a fast but ordinary downstream run. But rivers under rising water do not change all at once. The shift happens gradually, then suddenly. As bales continued downstream, the speed of the current began to increase further. The surface of the river showed more movement. Small standing waves formed where the water passed over shallow sections. Branches and pieces of debris appeared more frequently, drifting along the same path. These were signs that additional water was entering the system. Upstream rainfall was still moving through the watershed. Tributaries continued feeding the Great Miami River, adding volume and pressure to the current. With higher water levels, the river also changed shape. Gravel bars that normally appeared along the banks were now submerged. Access points that kayakers sometimes used to exit the river were harder to recognize. The current pressed harder against the outside edges of bends, where deeper water moved fastest. In normal conditions, a paddler can angle a kayak toward the shoreline and rest in calmer water near the bank. But as the current strengthened, steering toward shore required more effort. The kayak responded differently. Each time Bales attempted to move across the current, the river pushed the boat further downstream before he could complete the maneuver. The window for reaching the bank narrowed. Missed opportunities meant drifting past potential landing spots. The river was no longer simply assisting the journey. It was beginning to control it. By the time the full strength of the current became clear, the kayak had already traveled a significant distance from the original launch point. The riverbanks were moving past faster than expected. Bridges and landmarks appeared and disappeared with little time to react. Turning upstream was not realistic. Against a flood current, even strong paddlers cannot make progress. From that moment forward, the direction of travel was determined almost entirely by the river itself. Once the river reached full flood movement, control changed in a very practical way. The kayak was no longer moving because of paddling. It was moving because the river itself was moving. From that point forward, Bales's role shifted from traveling the river to managing his position within it. Floodwater carries energy across the entire width of a channel. The center current moves fastest, but the difference between the middle and the banks becomes smaller as the river rises. Water spreads outward, covering areas that are normally dry. Trees that usually stand above the shoreline begin to sit partially in the current. The river corridor becomes wider and less predictable. For a kayaker, this means fewer stable reference points. Gravel bars disappear beneath the surface. Small islands vanish. Shorelines blur into flooded vegetation. Bales continued drifting downstream through this changing environment. The current carried the kayak steadily south. Each bend in the river appeared quickly and passed just as quickly. Steering remained possible in short bursts, but the strength of the water limited how much influence the paddle could provide. Crossing the river from one bank to the other required careful timing. Attempting it at the wrong moment could place the kayak directly in faster water. Under flood conditions, the safest strategy in a small boat is often conservation. Fighting the current continuously can lead to rapid exhaustion. Instead, paddlers try to guide the boat when necessary and allow the river to do most of the work. Bales followed this approach as the miles accumulated. The kayak moved through long sections of open farmland where the river widened. In these areas, the water spread into low banks and flooded grassland. The current remained strong, but the absence of obstacles allowed smoother passage. Further downstream, the river corridor narrowed again. Here, the current accelerated as the water compressed between wooded banks. Fallen branches and floating debris collected along the outside edges of bends. Trees that normally stood well above the waterline now had lower branches touching the current. Navigating through these sections required constant observation. Large debris can trap small boats against obstacles. A kayak caught sideways in fast water can quickly become unstable. Paddlers try to stay angled with the current, allowing the boat to move with the flow rather than across it. Bales maintained this alignment as he traveled. Time on the river began to stretch beyond the length of a normal day trip. The distance covered was already greater than expected. Yet the current continued carrying the kayak forward at a pace that made stopping difficult. Each potential landing area required several conditions at once. The bank needed to be reachable from the main current. The shoreline needed to be clear enough to allow a kayak to approach. And the water near the bank needed to be slow enough to permit a controlled landing. During flood conditions, these opportunities become rare. In many places, the riverbank turns into a wall of moving water against trees and brush. Attempting to land in those areas risks being pushed into branches or submerged obstacles, so the kayak continued downstream. As daylight shifted, the river environment changed again. In rural sections of the Great Miami River Corridor, long distances pass between towns. Bridges appear occasionally, but large portions of the route move through quiet countryside. From the water, these sections feel isolated. Fields stretch beyond the banks. Tree lines follow the curves of the river. Houses and roads often sit back from the shoreline, sometimes hidden behind vegetation. For someone traveling quickly with the current, landmarks pass in brief intervals. Bales moved through these sections hour after hour. Fatigue becomes a factor during extended time in a small boat. Even when the current provides most of the movement, maintaining balance, steering when necessary, and remaining alert require energy. Hands remain on the paddle. The body stays upright to respond to sudden changes in water movement. The river does not pause. Floodwater also carries colder temperatures than surface water during normal conditions. Rainfall from upstream often enters the river at lower temperatures, gradually cooling the entire channel. Long exposure to this environment can drain physical energy, even without direct immersion. Bales continued managing the kayak through these conditions. At intervals, the river passed through small towns. Bridges crossed overhead, connecting roads that ran parallel to the river corridor. In some places, people along the banks noticed the kayak moving quickly downstream with the current. But flood conditions were affecting the region broadly. Rising water along the river was not unusual during heavy rain periods. A kayaker traveling downstream might not immediately signal an emergency. From the river itself, the sense of distance becomes difficult to measure. A paddler may pass a familiar town and expect the next landmark to appear within a short period of time. But flood currents shorten the perceived scale of travel. The kayak moves faster than normal paddling speed, covering long distances in a relatively short number of hours. Meanwhile, the river continues receiving water from upstream tributaries. The cumulative effect keeps the current strong. Even sections that normally slow the flow may remain swift during flood stage. Bales continued watching for landing opportunities. Occasionally, the riverbank opened slightly. A break in the trees or a shallow slope might appear along the shoreline. In those moments, steering toward shore required a precise approach. The kayak would need to angle out of the faster center current and reach the slower water near the edge. Several times, attempts brought the kayak close to the bank. But the current often moved the boat past the opening before a stable landing could occur. In floodwater, hesitation can carry a boat beyond the narrow window where a landing is possible. Once the moment passes, the river pulls the boat forward again. As the hours continued, the scale of the journey became clearer. The Great Miami River flows through multiple counties before eventually joining the Ohio River near the city of Hamilton. Between those points, the waterway covers a long distance through southwestern Ohio. Bales had entered the river, expecting a manageable trip along a familiar section. Instead, the flood current was transporting him far beyond the range of a typical recreational paddle. Still, the kayak remained stable. Small watercraft like kayaks can perform well in moving current as long as they remain upright and aligned with the flow. Their narrow shape allows them to ride over small waves and pass through swift water without excessive resistance. This stability allowed Bales to continue moving downstream safely, despite the circumstances. But endurance became the central factor. The river would continue carrying the kayak as long as the current remained strong. Without a safe landing point, the only option was to remain in the boat and continue searching for an opportunity to exit. Miles of river passed beneath the kayak. Fields, forests, bridges, and towns appeared briefly and moved behind him. The river corridor remained the same continuous path, guiding the floodwater southward. And within that current, the kayak continued traveling further away from its original launch point. By the time the full distance became known later, the river had carried Bales more than 100 miles downstream. At the time, however, the immediate concern remained much simpler. Find a place where the river would finally allow the journey to stop. By the time the river had carried the kayak deep into the lower sections of the Great Miami River corridor, the journey had already lasted far longer than intended. A typical recreational paddle on this river might last several hours. Even longer day trips usually end before nightfall. Access points along the banks normally allow paddlers to leave the water once their planned distance is complete. But flood conditions had changed those expectations. The current continued moving with steady force, and the shoreline remained difficult to approach safely. Many of the banks were still lined with trees standing directly in the water. Branches and debris collected where the current pressed against the outside of river bends. These areas formed natural traps that small boats try to avoid. Each time the kayak approached such sections, the safest decision was often to stay within the main current rather than risk becoming pinned against obstacles. That choice meant continuing downstream. Hours of continuous travel began to produce physical fatigue. Even when a kayak is largely carried by current, the paddler must remain alert and balanced. Sudden shifts in the water require quick adjustments with the paddle. Debris must be avoided. The boat must stay aligned with the flow. Maintaining that level of attention over extended time gradually drains energy. The body also remains exposed to the environment. Wind moves along the river corridor. Water temperature stays cool due to the volume of upstream runoff. Even without falling into the water, prolonged exposure can wear down endurance. Bales continued scanning the banks for a place where landing would be possible. Occasionally, the river opened toward low ground, where floodwater spread beyond the usual channel. In these places, the current sometimes weakened slightly near the edges. Reaching those calmer sections required crossing part of the moving river. Several attempts brought the kayak closer to shore, but timing remained difficult. The speed of the current carried the boat forward before a stable landing could be completed. Moments that appeared promising closed quickly as the river moved past them. Meanwhile, the distance traveled continued increasing. The Great Miami River flows through several towns as it moves south through Ohio. During this period, Bales passed areas including Middletown and eventually the larger community of Hamilton, far beyond the original launch region near Dayton. For someone in a small kayak, these towns would appear first as bridges, buildings set back from the shoreline, and signs of heavier infrastructure along the riverbanks. By the time these locations passed, the journey had already extended across a significant portion of the river's length. Physical exhaustion began to accumulate more noticeably. Extended time, seated in a kayak, places strain on the lower body and back. Hands, holding the paddle for long periods, begin to tire. Even brief moments of steering require effort when water moves this quickly. Despite the fatigue, the kayak remained stable and upright. The river itself was beginning to show signs of gradual change. As floodwater moved further downstream, sections of the current began spreading wider across the valley floor. In some places, the force of the water softened slightly, as the river approached larger, slower-moving stretches near its lower course. These changes would eventually create the conditions necessary for the journey to end. But until that moment arrived, the river still controlled the direction of travel, and the kayak continued moving south. Further downstream, the Great Miami River begins to widen as it approaches the region where it eventually joins the Ohio River. The surrounding valley opens slightly, and the river channel spreads across a broader landscape. When floodwater enters these wider sections, the speed of the current can begin to ease. For bales, this gradual change became noticeable after many hours on the river. The surface of the water still moved steadily, but the force pressing against the kayak began to feel less intense than in the narrower sections upstream. The river was still carrying the boat forward, but small adjustments with the paddle started to have greater effect. For the first time since the current had strengthened earlier in the journey, steering toward the shoreline became more realistic. The banks in these lower stretches also appeared different. Instead of tightly packed trees along steep edges, some areas opened into gentler slopes where farmland approached closer to the river. Floodwaters still covered parts of the ground near the shore, but the barriers created by dense brush and submerged branches were less common. Bales began guiding the kayak toward these quieter edges of the channel. Moving gradually out of the faster center current required patience. The boat angled slowly across the water, allowing the current to carry it forward while inching closer to the bank. With each adjustment, the speed of the water decreased slightly. Eventually, the kayak reached slower water near the edge of the river. From there, Bales was able to bring the boat close enough to the shoreline to exit safely. The journey that had begun near Dayton, Ohio, had continued more than 100 miles downstream, ending near the lower communities along the river corridor. What had started as an ordinary kayaking trip had become an unintended long-distance passage, carried almost entirely by floodwater. Once on land, the scale of the distance became clearer. The river had transported both paddler and kayak through much of the Great Miami River's course across southwestern Ohio. The movement of the water had determined nearly every mile of the route. Rivers measure distance differently than people do. From a map, the Great Miami River appears as a single line crossing southwestern Ohio. It begins as smaller tributaries, gathers water from farmland and towns, and eventually merges with the Ohio River after traveling more than 160 miles. For most paddlers, only short portions of that distance are ever experienced at one time. During flood conditions, however, the river behaves as a single moving system. Rain that falls across a wide watershed becomes one continuous flow, carrying water steadily from upstream regions toward lower ground. On one day, in April 2001, that movement carried a single kayak much farther than intended. The journey was not the result of exploration or endurance planning. It was the consequence of a river temporarily moving faster than expected. Once the current strengthened, the options available to a small boat became limited. In the end, the distance traveled more than 100 miles reflected the scale of the river itself. After the floodwaters passed, the Great Miami River returned to its ordinary rhythm. Water continued moving south, as it always had,